Welcome, everyone, to this event presented by the Institute for Security and Technology and the Alliance for Commercial Technology in Government. We'll be getting started here in just a minute to let more people file in. In the meantime, we invite you to follow IST and the Alliance on social media. Both orgs will be following up with more programming on this and other defense technology issues. So if this is your field, you'll definitely want to tune in. Again, our introduction session will begin momentarily. Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right, well, everyone, great to have you all here today. My name is Phil Reiner. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Security and Technology. We are exceedingly pleased to welcome Mr. Mike Brown, the Director of the Defense Innovation Unit. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, glad to be here.
Looking forward to this conversation. You know, it's pretty remarkable having watched the evolution of the DIU over the past few years now, from DIUX into the DIU that it is today. You know, you talk about having satellite offices. You really, I mean, you've got a constellation that you've built out with all of the different efforts focused on innovation and bringing technical capabilities to the warfighter, right? So I thought maybe what we do, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation, to talk a little bit about this notion of the Valley of Death, talk a little bit about what's happening, what needs to happen, how people can get involved. But I thought maybe we could take a step back at the beginning and, you know, ask you as to what's been working, what are some of the milestones you feel the DIU's hit? Where have things been progressing? Where have you seen progress, and what are you excited about?
Great. Well, the Defense Innovation Unit sometimes I think is a misnomer. It really should be named Defense Commercial Technology Unit. And with a lot of credit to my predecessor, Russ Shaw, who's going to be moderating the next panel, really the idea that innovation is a bit meaningless if you're not focused on solving problems. So with hats off to Raj, he saw that what the Defense Innovation Unit needed to do is be a lot more than a tech scout or an ambassador to the places where we're located, but we need to work on projects that solve urgent needs of the Defense Department, and then pair that with great commercial technology where a lot of the innovation in our country is happening.
Yeah.
Ash Carter saw that we really needed to tap into all of the innovation that was happening outside DoD and its traditional suppliers. So what I've tried to do is really scale that. How can we expand the impact that we're having by reaching more companies, have them participate in more projects? So just as a quick example, so last year we started 37 projects. The average over our 6-year history was 20. We've had several thousand companies respond with submissions, meaning their solutions to whatever those DoD problems are. Last year, we had 1,000 alone. So we're really expanding in terms of number of projects and companies that are participating in this ecosystem. Of course, we benefit from the fact that using other transaction authority, we're able to move companies from a successful prototype into production without recompeting. So that allows them to more quickly be able to participate in a defense ecosystem. So I'd say we're all about maximizing competition and minimizing that opportunity cost for companies so that more can participate. The Department of Defense absolutely needs the participation of non-traditional, smaller, innovative companies to support the mission that we're on. 8 of the 10 modernization priorities of the Defense Department are led by the commercial sector. We're talking about AI, space, autonomous systems, bioengineering, et cetera. So we really need that innovation across the US which is the reason we opened the Chicago office. We think there's a lot more we can harness in the Midwest.
And I agree. Having spent a little bit of time in Chicago, I think it's a hub that can be tapped into. So one of the things that we have to take in consideration as we think about everything that you were just getting at, right? So it's not just about innovation; it's actually solving problems.
Right.
The juxtaposition, right, against the pacing threat or the pacing challenge posed by a country like China, where they have really a different model of approaching this sort of issues, right? They've got the civil military fusion perspective. There's a kind of a symbiotic relationship between industry and what the government does. You basically need to be tapped into what the government wants from you in order to actually be able to run business there. Now, as you've gone through this process, you see the things that really do need to change. What else needs to change in terms of the fundamentals that we're grappling with, right? So the OTAs, the number of projects that are engaged, the number of folks that are getting into it, but it's still rather de minimis vis-a-vis the challenge, right? So
absolutely,
yeah, are we just nibbling at the margins, or what?
In fact, I would say while I'm very proud of the work that DIU is doing, we're a drop in the bucket in terms of mainstream defense procurement. In the time we've influenced $1 to $2 billion of procurement, the Defense Department has bought $1 trillion worth of gear. Right. So if we think about the overall system that governs procurement at the Pentagon, believe it or not, it really came into being around 1961 when Robert McNamara came in. So this points to the need to reform it. There's really three interlocking systems that are involved in procurement. Requirements, deciding what we need, acquisition, which is the process of buying, of course, and then budgeting. All of those are not agile processes. They need very long lead times. A lot of energy from Congress has been focused on acquisition. That's what gave us other transaction authority and other reforms. Actually, we need reform on the other two, requirements and budgeting. Requirements for commercial technology is almost a non sequitur. We don't need to tell the commercial market what to build. They've already built it. So that needs to be changed so we can move much faster. And then budgeting. And that really is, I know you want to talk about the valley of death. DoD unique valley of death is where we bring a company through a successful prototype and they're ready to scale. And the department says, wait, I haven't budgeted for that yet. So that process of 2.5 years of budgeting really needs to be condensed, and we need some flexibility around the edges so that successful technology can scale more quickly.
So before we delve a little bit further into that and what some of the opportunities are, and what some of the things that really need to be done to change that budget process, you've spent time thinking about that pacing threat. You've written about this. This was prior to coming in to help lead DIU. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, that pacing threat? Are we, from where you sit and everything that you see and the responsibilities you have and all of those priorities that have been listed out, are we keeping up? Are we moving fast enough? Are we at risk of falling behind a little bit here?
We're definitely not keeping up. The prosperity that we're enjoying in the U.S. and the technology advantage that we've enjoyed basically since World War II is eroding rapidly. So China is being very aggressive in terms of their investments in technology. They now see that there's an opportunity through setting standards. They're now focused on something they call China Standards 2035. They've seen the benefit of what they can create with Huawei and 5G. They want to replicate that across satellites, advanced computing, bioengineering, et cetera. They basically would like to hollow out or displace all of the Western companies that have leading technology positions. So they see Huawei and 5G as just the tip of the iceberg. They want to compete with Baidu and AI, on and on. So if we're not focused on helping to set those international standards, making the long-term investments in research and technology, developing the STEM talent that we need, inspiring people with moonshots for the future, and supporting companies on the world stage. I don't expect we do the same techniques that China does, which is very mercantilist. But there's a whole range of policies which really get to an industrial policy for the US that ensures that technology companies have every advantage in competing on the world stage. then we're not going to be able to maintain the technology edge that we would like to enjoy for the future.
So it takes us, it's a perfect segue, right? It takes us right to the conversation that we were aiming to have today. I think, we're in the midst of the NDAA moving through its process. There's lots of considerations that go into the acquisitions piece. So this notion of the Valley of Death, I think anybody who's listening to this call is probably familiar with it. You began to describe it already. For those who are interested in bringing technologies to bear on this national security problem set, everything that we were just talking about, to make sure that we're maintaining that balance with China, maintaining a competitive edge. What is the Valley of Death from your perspective, and what is that challenge that we've actually created for ourselves, right?
Well, there's several valleys of death if you're a young company trying to be successful. The one that's specific to DoD is not about forming the company or getting that first round. If you're a hardware company, getting production started, those are all important transition points. But in working with the Department of Defense, the specific one that we have created for companies is, again, successfully demonstrating the capability, or we would say prototyping, but then not having the money in the budget to scale that. So that's a DoD unique valley of death that we need to solve. We've worked on that at DIU to help qualify the customer better, the customer being a DoD mission partner. And what we have to do there is make sure that when we start a project, that the DoD mission partner understands what the prototyping period could be, because it could be a lot quicker than the budgeting window, meaning we might be able to prototype this successfully in less than a year, but the entire budgeting cycle is 2.5 years. So that mission partner needs to understand that and make sure there's money allocated. And we've had some success in increasing the transition rate of DoD projects, meaning those, about all the projects we start, how many lead to a production contract and scaled capability. We don't view we're successful until capabilities in warfighters' hands. Just doing rapid prototyping is really not being successful. Yeah. So this is something that we've done to solve the problem, better qualify the customer DoD mission partner, but we need help from Congress here to give the DoD a little more flexibility, not maybe for the entire budget, but when they see the threat evolving and new technology that can solve that, can they move money around? That's a very cumbersome process in the Pentagon today called reprogramming. So yeah. Some improvement needs to be done there. There's an idea in the NDAA called the Warfighter Innovation Scaling Fund. We need to wait and see if appropriators will put money behind that. But that is a fund that would allow for this situation. Think about it as, I'm a mission partner, but I haven't budgeted for that yet, but I will. But I can take money from this working capital fund and help scale a technology, and then later put that in the budget. So that's a bit of a Band-Aid, certainly a great step forward. Love to see that become law and funded. But we need to think about larger budgeting reforms. And there is also a provision in the Senate version of the NDAA looking for a commission to study the PPB&E, programming, planning, budgeting, and execution, which is this process I referred to that was state of the art when Robert McNamara brought it in 1961. It's time to look at that again.
Yeah, there's a few other things in this life that Robert McNamara may have been at the cutting edge of, but not so much these days. Right. So when thinking about that Warfighter Innovation Fund, thinking about the fact that it still needs, you still need the appropriations to come along with it. You mentioned that it's kind of Band-Aid. How can those who are out there who are building technologies, who are building companies around things that they want to bring to bear, that they want to bring to the warfighter, how can they, what's the upper limit on that Warfighter Fund if it does come through? How does that actually change the game as a Band-Aid, maybe even as we look towards some of those more bigger changes that need to take place on the budgeting cycle? How does this actually give people some assurance that what they're trying to get done is maybe going to happen if that fund comes through?
So it's targeted at $100 million, basically viewed as a pilot program. I think we'd be able to use that up pretty quickly, yeah. But it certainly would demonstrate the need for this. I think the longer term solution, especially for commercial technologies, like the ones we're talking about, small drones, AI software, cyber, et cetera, would be to think about capabilities that we need to budget for instead of specific items. So if you think about a program of record, typically that is a specific vendor and capability. think about Lockheed Martin for the F-35. Congress is providing money to buy that already qualified item. We need to be more general in thinking about the commercial technology because they're moving so much faster. I mean, the F-35 design began 20 years ago with requirements. It might be around for many more decades. Many of the capabilities we're talking about have much shorter life cycles, and the Pentagon needs to think about owning this for a shorter period of time. So if there were a budget for capabilities, say small drones, group 1, which means small consumer class drones, we need to have a budgeted line item for that, and then let the Pentagon determine who are the vendors, what are the capabilities that we need, and not be micromanaging exactly what's spent for any particular part and vendor. Very inefficient, does not keep up with technology, and frankly doesn't allow for the best value for the taxpayer. Refreshing that technology increases the competition and increases the value that the Pentagon and the taxpayer get. So we need to think about the budgeting in that way for these capabilities, and then let the Pentagon do its work to quickly assess new technology to match the evolving threat, and then ensure that we can field that latest technology to the warfighters. A much better way of going about it. And the commercial world has already shown us the path there.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, this touches up to the extent of my understanding of how the process works. How much of that you're referring to can actually be done without movement by Congress? That sort of more inherent flexibility by the program officers or by the PEOs. I mean, at the core of it, you alluded to the Senate version, which has the language about the commission. That's a multi-year process.
Right.
Are there things in the interim that potentially can kind of shake this loose? It's not as though the pacing threat, right, is slowing down at all because we can't move our bureaucracy fast enough.
Totally.
Right. What do you see in the mix here that can actually maybe shake it up and move things a little bit faster?
Well, I'd love to see DoD propose to Congress that let's try this out with a couple of key technologies. Example could be small drones or commercial satellite imagery. We know we're going to need these things for a very long time on an ongoing basis. It's not something that's we only need for a year or two. And we should pilot that and show the way to be able to budget for this capability area, qualify new technologies, get that in the hands of the warfighter. I'd love to be piloting that at DIU, and in fact, have proposed that. We need DoD leadership to agree with that, and we need the appropriators to be comfortable that that would be a pilot that we could try, and if successful, we could expand that. There's no reason why we can't be buying all commercial technologies in that way.
Fascinating. One thing I wanted to touch on as well as we go through this conversation, it's a bit further afield than this notion of Valley of Death, has to do with the National Security Innovation Capital effort that's been stood up. This notion of adversarial capital, again, I think a lot of folks who are on the call here today come from a community where there's a lot of back and forth about where does the money come from, and who is it that's actually doing the investing, and how concerned does one need to be, how wary do they need to be about where they're taking investment from. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about what is the National Security Innovation Capital effort, and what is this this challenge posed by quote unquote adversarial capital?
Well, let's start with the challenge. China and to a lesser extent Russia have been very aggressive in understanding where is new technology being developed around the world. And certainly in China's case, they have a very systematic approach to bringing that technology back home to China so that they can innovate upon it. I would say to anyone who thinks China is just copying technology and is a low-cost manufacturer, please update your view. They're definitely innovating today. You don't have to look any further than the hypersonic test that they just did with the orbital glide vehicle to see they're innovating today on technology that maybe was developed elsewhere, but they're bringing innovation to it. So in their search for technology, they have also focused on Silicon Valley, Route 128, and other innovation hubs. So they're very happy to buy technology. Some of that has been clamped down with the reforms for CFIUS, one of which I was able to work on, Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. So we've looked on the defensive side there, but they for years have been investing legally in technology, and that includes investments in Silicon Valley companies or elsewhere across the VC landscape.
Yeah.
I worked on a study that showed that in starting in the mid 20 teens, China was involved in as much as 15% of all venture deals in the US. China being Chinese-backed investors. China has created over 500 different investing entities that mimic Western forms of investment, venture capital, private equity, growth equity, et cetera. So very aggressive in understanding where the technology is. And I believe when they see interesting technology, they're interested in either trying to buy it, starting an industrial espionage operation to see if they can steal it, attracting the talent through the 1,000 Talents program to see if they can bring some of those folks back to China, and of course, cyber theft. So they're certainly more aggressive than any other country ever in terms of their cyber activities, which all countries are involved in some cyber spying, but in their case, it's to directly benefit the commercial sector in China. So with all of that activity going on, there should be no surprise that, yes, they use investment as a way also to understand what's happening in our most innovative tech startups. So that's the adversarial capital problem. We're more acute in hardware than software, and that's because our venture capital industry has largely moved to software, and in some cases moved away from early stage hardware, where the risk is can be the highest or perceived to be the highest. So we saw a need for the government to step in and catalyze private investment for hardware technologies that are being commercialized. That's the idea behind National Security Innovation Capital. So we proposed this. Fortunately, it was adopted by Congress, and we got a very small appropriation last year of $15 million to start investing in the future hardware vendors, which we would hope DIU would be able to take advantage of. So we invested in 9 companies last year. Those were in the form of grants, so it was non-dilutive capital that allowed those companies to get to their next stage of development, hopefully attract private capital. In one case, that's already happened. They were able to raise a round based on our investment. We're signaling that this is a technology area that DoD is interested in, and that this company has something in particular that is of interest in terms of the technology, their approach to the problem. So we're hoping through that signaling to attract a lot more private capital, and then create a virtuous circle where we're able to fund more hardware vendors of the future. Because while we very much enjoy the comparative advantage in the US that we have in the software industry, the military needs hardware. We need batteries, we need quantum sensors, we need systems in space that service satellites, et cetera.
So real quick, for anybody who's out there who may not know, how does one who's interested in learning more or even getting involved with that innovation capital fund, how do they get involved? How do they connect?
Yeah, take a look at our website, which is nsic.mil, or you can take a look at the DIU website, diu.mil, or you can certainly write me, Michael, at diu.mil, and we'll get you to the right people at DIU.
Perfect. So one last thing that I wanted to touch upon, and then we'll turn it over to Raj in the follow-on panel. There's a lot at play here, and a lot of it is driven by Congress. How can people that are out there who are, again, those who are building things, right? Those who are building companies around these capabilities, how can they help? What can they do to get involved? So not just sending you an email to get involved with the Innovation Capital Fund. What can they be doing to help kind of move this conversation? Because one of the reasons we wanted to make sure we had this conversation was to really assert the case that as you think about that pacing threat, they are not slowing down, and yet we seem to continue to think of things in large part as business as usual. What can folks do to help kind of energize some change in the process?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there's a couple of things that we can do. Number one, thank you. I think we need to be having more conversations. This needs to be part of our national agenda. It isn't unless we're talking about it and highlighting the fact that we're in a tech race, whether we know it or not. China is creating this because they're the ones investing, have very aggressive plans, of course, to displace us economically, technologically. So we need to be aware that that's the case. And if you think about that, then anyone who is either supporting directly the Defense Department in its mission, or developing technologies that will add to national capability is helping with that. We need to also be encouraging more people to join in these fields, to study STEM fields, to think about joining technology companies, advancing this area. And then, of course, if you're interested in moving the agenda forward, stay in touch with Congress, write your congressman about your concern here and your interest in moving things forward. There's a bill that's waiting to be passed, the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act. Some have called it the China Bill, began life as the Endless Frontiers Act. Yeah. This really is stimulating the investment in science and technology. It's one of the steps along the way that we need to recognize that we're in a tech race and government has a role to play there in terms of investment. If you think about it, a lot of the technologies that we enjoy today, from GPS to internet to miniaturized electronics, are all a result of government investment. We tend to think that the venture capital industry is going to take care of us for the long term, and I'm a huge fan of what VCs do. But of course, they're motivated by efficiency of capital and profit. And the government has a role here to play in terms of what national capabilities do we need that perhaps aren't as attractive to the private sector. So we need to invest in those technologies. We need government playing a role. The great thing about our economy is once government plays a role and proves that technology is feasible, think about the internet and GPS, then you get a plethora of either new industries and new companies. You know, where would we be? We wouldn't have Uber or Airbnb without those basic investments in internet and GPS, as an example.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'm consistently struck by looking back at the history of Silicon Valley, right, and thinking about really so not just the technological development, not just the investment, but the strategic thinking that occurred through that sort of engagement back, for 50s and 60s, 70s, McNamara era, et cetera. It can be enlivened again. So genuinely appreciate everything that you guys are doing at DIU. It's, Sisyphean task on many a day, but I think it's definitely, it's having impact, and that's the most important piece. So anybody out there on the call, definitely to join in and help out with what DIU is trying to get done, but also engage with your congressional representatives and raise awareness of what some of these challenges are. We definitely need to be taking this as seriously as we take anything. Mike, thanks for everything, and we'll wrap it up there, and we'll turn things over to Raj and the panel that'll follow us. But thank you again for making the time here.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Absolutely. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right. Thanks much to Director Brown for those key insights. We'll be handing things off to the panel discussion after just a few minutes break here to let us change gears. Thank you all again for attending. We will continue in just a few moments. All right, now to take us away on our second panel, please welcome Hoover visiting fellow Raj Shah, previously at DIUX as well. Raj, take it away.
Thank you. It's great to be here with everyone. We have an exciting topic and one that's been debated much. But first off, many thanks to Phil Reiner and the Institute for Security and Technology for hosting us, and much appreciation to Mike Brown for setting the stage and for the work that he and his team continue to do. So today, what I wanted to do with this panel is first we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around what's working, what's not working, what's changed over the last 5 years. This is a topic that's been front and center for many of us for a long time. So love to get a sense from the panelists of where we are. And then we'll save a little bit of time at the end for questions and comments from the attendees. Please use the chat. But before diving in, it'd be great if David, Megan, and Jeff could quickly introduce yourselves and your role in this ecosystem. So maybe I'll start at the top left, David. You're still on mute. David, I think you're still on mute.
There you go. Hopefully that works. Yeah, technology. So thank you, Raj, and thank you for IST. I'm Dave Borland, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Commercial Technology and Government. Thank you for IST for co-hosting this event with us, and we're using this to launch our kind of annual conference. And so I know that a lot of our membership is participating in this event, and so thank you for being a part of this and helping these companies by kind of being a part of this conversation. The way that I came to this area is I was at the Pentagon for 8 years. A big part of what I was working on toward the latter half of that time was strategy and budget questions, and what we were at the time calling the third offset strategy, really focused on, how do we maintain a strategic advantage in the world as we see near-peer competitors rise. And so a big part of that did focus on our really innovative and successful technology sector, but with no clear path in many cases to use that dual use capability that many of these companies have. There's no great way to kind of get that technology in the hands of those people that are really, making sure that the United States is secure and prosperous around the world. And so a big part of what, we focused on there was, how do we kind of make sure that, the warfighter is benefiting from these technologies, that, we are kind of using as a government all of the tech that we're developing. And so that, as I left government and left the Pentagon, that problem set stayed with me and that challenge. And so that led me, to kind of want to participate in this organization, lead this organization that's really focused on kind of solving that challenge and addressing it as best we can through advocacy, through kind of using the education tools that we have available and learning from the companies about where their pain points are and being their voice in Washington, D.C. So that's what we're trying to do as an organization. That's a little bit about my background. And I look forward to speaking with you on the panel.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Megan?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Megan Metzger, I'm the CEO of Decode, and where we fit in this whole crazy world is Decode actually runs an accelerator program for high growth tech companies to make the market less risky to enter. So we've been doing this for about 5+ years. I think we launched right about the time, Raj, you came on the scene with DIU, and realizing that there needs to be a better way to make the market attractive for tech companies, and also make sure the tech companies aren't one-hit innovation wonders in the DoD and across the government. We also help the government understand how to be better customers for tech and implement innovative methodologies and kind of hack the own bureaucracy that we have to actually get the solutions in the door. Also just helped launch the alliance that Dave is a part of, because felt really passionately that there needs to be an association here to represent all these high growth tech companies that don't necessarily know or understand what needs to be advocated for on the Hill. It's going to make it easier for all of us to go after this gnarly challenge that we're going to talk about today. And the last thing I'd say is we have Decode Capital. So we put our money where our mouth is, and we double down on the companies that we know could really make the government better.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Raj. Really appreciate you having me here today. Jeff Fair, I'm the General Counsel at the National Venture Capital Association. So we represent a lot of the investors that are investing in these high growth companies that have been referenced. We have more than 400 member firms spread across the country, investing in really every area of the economy that VCs invest in. And so we've been active with the Alliance and with Decode, really trying to push for public policy that makes the United States the best place in the world to launch a high growth company. And happy to talk today about some of the challenges that we see and really work together going forward.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's start with what's working, right? So 5 years ago, as you said, Megan, there was basically one government or government affiliated institution in town. That was InQtel. Now we've got obviously DIU, SoftWorks, AFWorks, Army Futures Command, and I think there's a couple more that crop up every month. Hard to keep up. If we look at that spectrum of the valley of death, if I look on the left side now, it seems that if you're just getting started and you want to work in defense, it's a great time. There's lots of opportunity. And then we'll also contrast, if we look at the other side, on those that have potentially crossed that valley, there's probably never been more unicorn defense focused startups than today, from Anduril, Rebellion, Hawkeye 360, and of course, Palantir SpaceX. So it feels like we're winning. Are we?
I would give us a B- or a C+, perhaps. I have to say, candidly, when I started Decode, I thought I was going to have to push the boulder up the hill. So the concept was teach tech companies how to navigate around all the minutia of the government and figure out how to do it on their own, because I saw such a gap of what commercial technology was doing and the pace that the government was moving. And I still remember the first time a government agency called into Decode. It was NGA of all agencies, and said, we need to talk to your tech companies, help us. And just quickly realized how much of the problem was really cultural and an educational component. The government, I think we have a lot of the authorities we need to do this, and we don't totally understand how to be creative or leverage them effectively. We've made a lot of progress. I have to say, one, the conversation has started. Some things got broken. We bowled in the China shop a couple of different things like the SBIR and some things that really started the conversation. When I started Decode, VCs were coming to us saying, we have no freaking idea what to do. And really, I had to sell all of the tech companies on whether or not the market was good. And now that's not the conversation as much as how do I do it more efficiently and not as risky and not spend as much money figuring it out. So it has shifted. We just need to take that shift, accelerate it 10,000 times over, and start focusing on the innovation catchers that have to put this into the large acquisition programs.
Okay, we've got a B+ for Megan. David, what do you rate it?
I don't know. I mean, letter grades are hard, but yeah, I mean, B+ is probably the best that we could do. But the way that I look at it when I'm interacting with the federal government is I see pockets of innovation, and we seek those out because they are truly champions of this stuff. DIU, AFWorks, even U.S. Digital Services. There are a number of places, even kind of outside of DoD, where there is a big concerted effort to make this work better and work better for these companies. Even SAM.gov and changing how we do kind of even submissions for acquisition. We're making some progress. The challenge is to make sure that those things are resourced properly, make sure that we, as things, you'll hear it probably a lot in this conversation, small business innovation research, making sure that that's an effective program as we go into reauthorization. How are we going to build on the success that we've had and make those pockets, not just pockets, but kind of the way that DoD acquisition works, the way that government acquisition works, to really harness everything that we're seeing happen in the U.S. tech sector, which is incredible.
Great. Sounds like we may be grading on a curve. Jeff, how do you think about this, and in specific, from the view of how the venture community is viewing how the last 5 years have gone?
Yeah, I think that Dave and Megan have made a lot of great points. I kind of think about, I came to NVCA almost 6 years ago, and I think about the arc of the conversation over that time. And I think it's probably been a very, very effective and transformational last several years. And I think back to the conversations I had in the very early days where there were some government agencies that will remain unnamed here that were trying to do things in this called the innovation space. And I remember it was a little bit of an eye roll from a lot of people like, okay, we've seen this movie before. And yes, they're going to put a tiny bit of money behind this. And they're going to say that the welcome mat is open, but it's going to be horrendous trying to deal with contracting. And it's going to be horrendous trying to get a quick answer, yes or no. And I kind of quickly thought, okay, that's interesting. That's good feedback to kind of get to understand that people have been burned by this process before. But I think now there's been such an avalanche of a lot of the entities, Raj, that you mentioned, that I think that it's being taken a lot more seriously, where you don't see that eye rolling anymore. You see an interest in the defense tech space. You see an interest in the intelligence community. You see real capital being deployed into these companies. And I think a lot of it also is really people have had a very, very positive experience with entities like DIU, with In-Q-Tel, and it's given a lot of legitimacy to what's gone on. And so we now are seeing more enthusiasm from a lot of our members. And I think that it's really a great thing for venture. It's a great thing for startups, and it's a great thing for the country.
Great. Okay, so let's take the other side of the coin. So Mike Brown in his remarks, talked a little bit about scale or lack thereof. If I were to look, okay, we have all these organizations now, but if I were to just roughly do the math of how much spend they did in the Valley across DIU and all those guys, maybe it's $1 billion, maybe it's $2 billion. But if you look at the DoD budget, not including the intelligence organizations, right, $770 billion a year. And part of the whole push for this defense innovation and the Valley is the understanding that, hey, technologies like cybersecurity and AI are going to be led from places out here. So if we haven't even gotten to 1%, if we really think that this is the government thinks this is the future of war, and we can't get ourselves to spend 1%, is Congress, is DoD taking this seriously? How do you respond to that?
I'll start by saying there's a lot to unpack, and I don't think it's a one size fits all answer. One of the biggest gaps that I think I still see that we really need to affect change on are the large sustainment programs and the large acquisition programs. So we're doing work as Decode right now on advising a DoD component on a major multi-billion-dollar IT acquisition. And the thought was they will award a task order for innovation in year 2 off to the side. We said, time out, you've already failed. At that point, it's not an off to the side, nice to have. It has to be ingrained from day one into all the requirements so that you're not blocking innovation out of the gate. So I think the mindset shift that needs to happen is that it shouldn't just be up to these innovation programs and buckets like DIU. It should be ingrained into the process starting from day one for major IT procurements. And that requires a change in the innovation catchers, the support functions like acquisitions and finance, but it requires the systems integrators to get on board too.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice for the integrators. Maybe Jeff, I'll turn to you. Now we're sort of down the phase of maybe giving advice or prescriptions from the venture capital community. What recommendations would you offer to either the DoD or Congress to accelerate and continue this trend that you described?
Raj, when you were talking about the percentage of what's been invested as a comparison of the DoD budget, I was thinking about where that sits relative to the amount of venture capital that's going on in the country. If you look at last year in the United States, we had about $165 billion that was invested in companies from VCs. This year, we're on track to probably exceed $200 billion. And so you think about the figures that you put forward, Raj, and it's obviously a pittance compared to that. I mean, the good news is that the capital that our members are investing is going into a lot of other things that don't really have a defense angle to them. So it's not really a fair comparison. But I think the point that I would want to make here is that we're probably for a very long time going to be in a situation where the actual dollars going into a lot of these early stage companies from the government is probably going to be a very small amount as amount of the overall capital that's there. So what I think the government needs to be thinking about is, okay, what other things can we do besides just providing money to these companies that would be valuable to them. And I think about Incutel, where yes, you get money as a company when Incutel invests in you, but you get a lot of other things too for it. You're able to kind of get a lot of visibility into the agencies. You're able to get a little bit of a hand holding so that people can kind of understand the way in which you get partners and you get customers. And I think that other agencies and entities have a lot to learn from them, so that we aren't just relying upon the money invested, but we're also relying upon the expertise that gets people in the Pentagon, that gets them into a lot of the contracts that they ultimately want to be awarded.
No. And any specifics there you think what would be most valuable, if they could do 2 or 3 things and those things that are non just financial that you described?
I think the biggest thing that I think would be a takeaway is that I think that people take for granted just how intimidating the Pentagon and the military is in general. And I think that having an ability to be able to have those warm introductions, to build those relationships, to be able to do a lot of the navigation, that's going to be something that is really, really impressive to a lot of people. I think a lot of times about what VCs are doing, where they're trying to introduce their portfolio companies to prospective customers, and they're trying to do that within maybe a large corporation, help them navigate various departments within a Salesforce or a Cisco or an HP or an Alphabet or something like that. And then you think of the size of the US government and of the Pentagon, and you're talking about a very different thing there. And so I think that really in that way, kind of being that navigational tool is perhaps the biggest thing that can be had.
That's great. Great. So David, maybe we'll turn the other side of the coin, which is on the entrepreneur side. There's been an amazing amount of interest of engineers and technologists, entrepreneurs to focus in on this space. What and I think this is what your organization does, but what sort of counsel and advice do you give to a budding entrepreneur that's at the very early stage of this journey?
Yeah, so thanks. And I think a key part of this is consider the government market, right? I mean, as you're developing these products, think about it. And this gets to some of the conversation with Director Mike Brown earlier is, if you're thinking about the government market, you may avoid taking money from China as you get started. You may avoid, doing some things that would preclude you from participating in the government market. But then, what I would say is that government market is a challenge. It is not going to work as easily as selling your commercial product, but the payoff is, I think, twofold. One is that, as you mentioned, the DoD budget and our federal government budget is enormous. And so you're accessing that market could be extremely valuable to you if you have the technologies that could be useful in that way. And the other part is that you get to participate in something that could actually change, kind of the balance of power, the balance of how these things work. And, I think for a lot of veteran entrepreneurs, people who are looking to tie what they're trying to do to a mission, it's a lot easier to say, hey, I'm doing something that, makes our country safer, makes our country work better, makes our taxpayers get better value for the taxes that they pay, as opposed to, this algorithm makes it easier for people to engage with this advertising content, right? And so I think if you want to inspire your workforce, if you think about that stuff from the moment that you start to build your product, I think it can make a big difference. And of course, as when we talk to the government side, then you've got to be receptive to that, right? You have to be able to have ways to interact with those companies as they're starting to grow, as they're starting to develop their products from the very beginning.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's great. So now let's maybe get to the heart of the title of this panel, which is the crossing the valley of death for these startups and young companies, and maybe we can look at it through a couple of different lenses. So what are things that the venture community can do to help? What are things that entrepreneurs, as they design their business and their business models? And then, of course, finally, we will come to what role is the government here. But I guess the approach I want to take is probably a little bit different, is that instead of just, here's a list of things the government has to do, that we know they're not necessarily the fastest moving folks out there. So what can people in the ecosystem today, right, both founders and capital providers do? So we'll get to that, and then I'll to the attendees, please begin to populate your questions, because we like to turn to those and discuss what's on your mind. So maybe Megan, we'll start with you. So in that vein, how should you help incubate companies? How should they structurally think about designing their businesses to maximize success of crossing that chasm?
Sure. Yeah, this is a challenge that we tackle 100+ times a year. So we have accelerated, well over 100 companies with great success in getting over this valley. And I'd say you have to think about two different things. One, so we support the federal teams, and we also support the C-suite. And there's two different modes of attack for this. So one, on the federal team side, like Jeff said, the DoD and the government's Fortune 1. You're not going to go after the entire market with a blanket approach. That's going to be a massive waste of your time. So you need to identify what use case and what you've sold in the commercial sector that translates well, and really surgically go after opportunities and look at what programs need what you have, what integrators and partners are in there, and really understand the ecosystem. An ounce of prevention on research will really go a long way in shortening that time frame. But then once you're in there, you have to plan ahead from day one. And so where we see it go south a lot is if the board is not absolutely bought in, or the C-suite, on understanding the timelines and the resource commitment, that's when things go wrong. So if you have a team going after the federal government, take the time to understand when you would need to scale up your resources, go ahead and plan financially how you might need to do that, because there might be a lag in payment from the government. So can you work with the banks that you have against the awards that you have, and then understand how to staff it appropriately. We see a lot of teams actually go south when they overstaff out of the gate. So they say, I'm going to hire 20 BD resources. We're going to go after the market. We're going to sell a bunch of stuff. It doesn't work like that here. So you have to be really efficient in how you do the resourcing, and then just plan ahead. So obviously there's a lot of folks out there that can really help with guiding on how to do that effectively. The other thing I would say though is don't necessarily go back to DIU and ask them how to staff your own organization or how to price. That's not what they're good for. They're good for giving you the mission statements and the problem statements and getting you on a contract. Turn to other folks like Decoded or the Alliance and the like that can give you good advice on how to change your operations.
That's great. David?
Yeah, a shameless plug for my own organization, right? But what I would say is get help, right? Is the federal marketplace, we're trying to break down these barriers, but the federal marketplace looks different than selling in the commercial sector. And our goal as an organization are try to move those a little closer, so that you don't have to have, retired 3- and 4-star generals on staff, and you don't have to go and have a lobbying team dedicated to the federal marketplace in order to win your first contract with government. But you do need a voice, right? You need to have that voice in Washington, D.C. You need to have some understanding of how that federal marketplace works. And we think the Alliance is a good way to kind of, get your foot in the door. But there are many resources, and finding those resources that can help you kind of get in and explore that marketplace, figure out things like SBIR awards, OTA authority, commercial solutions offerings, what is available? How can you kind of do those things that may fall outside of, just bidding on a contract on sam.gov, that would actually start to build those relationships and give you access to that market. Those are the ways to explore. And like Megan was saying, you can start to build your federal market business based on some of the success that you see by kind of dipping your toes in that water. And so that can be a way in, right? Because yes, the federal government is clearly daunting, as Jeff was talking about too, right? The federal government is clearly daunting. If you just look at it and say, where do you knock on the door of the federal government and say, yes, I'd like to bid on these contracts. But when you do start to break it down and look at where you can most usefully sell your products, it can be a manageable workplace, especially when you seek that help.
Can I just add on a word of caution? Do not go lightly into finding help. So very candidly, one of the reasons I started Decode was because I watched tech companies pay a fortune for lobbyists, a ton of BD folks, marketing firms, you name it. And next thing you know, you'll spend $500,000 figuring out if the market even wants what you have. And that is not the best approach. I would say the good news about the government industry is there's a lot of data available at your fingertips, unlike any other market that you'll find in the commercial sector. So whether it's finding where this money is being spent and pinpointing which agencies to go after, it's also kind of like a high school in here sometimes where you can quickly do research and find out reputations of the folks you're engaging with. But I would say do not go out and hire a million different consultants to do this. That's not going to be your best approach. Start with the resources you have. If you have venture investors, they can make introductions, but then you have to figure out what to do with that introduction. So if you're going to start somewhere, learn the procurement process first. That's the best place to hack it. So I just wanted to say that because I'm not advocating for everyone to spend a gajillion dollars to figure it out.
Got it. No, that's great advice. So, and Jeff, I'm going to turn to you here in a second, but you know, the one of the core elements of this valley of death is the mismatch in timing expectations from how the DoD works and how the traditional venture funding cycle works. And I'm sure our audience is familiar, but just to be explicit, you know, the traditional venture cycle is you raise every 18 months, maybe it's closer to 12 months these days, and you have to reach certain milestones of customer traction in order to keep your business running and get that next round of financing to keep going. The DoD, you know, these new organizations like DIU and others do move at that speed, but you're going to get one or two contracts, and that doesn't get you to something that is lasting and long term, which traditionally this thing called a program of record takes maybe 4 or 5 years. People are trying to accelerate it, but even in a best case scenario, it's 2 to 3 years out, just the way how the government does its budgeting, and has been doing that for decades. So the question for you, Jeff, is, what can, from the venture side, be done to address this, sort of structural mismatch of timelines?
Raj, I think it's a great observation. I think the one thing that people may or may not realize is that venture is a discipline, and within the discipline there are specializations that are out there, and VCs make whole careers focused on fairly narrow aspects of the market. In many cases, some are more generalist, but many are not. And so what I imagine is going on now is as defense tech space takes off, is that you have a kind of mini discipline that's breaking out of people who appreciate a lot of what it is that Megan and Dave have said, and are becoming very, very skilled at navigating a lot of that. And so I think that you're likely to see people who have been through this before, that understand the mismatch that you're talking about, Raj. And I think that the hopeful situation is that those investors, those general partners in the funds, also have alignment with their limited partners, and the limited partners understand that when they invest in particular funds, that this is not something where it's a SaaS model, or it's something that might look a little bit different in terms of returning capital to limited partners, but there might be a bit of a longer horizon. There might be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that looks and is shaped like the Pentagon. And so that is something that hopefully is happening in the marketplace. So I think that one thing for founders to look out for is to try and find those people that have become skilled at navigating a very different animal. I think that there is some good news here, which is that while a lot of VCs go out of their way to kind of invest around the government in many situations where they don't want to be in a situation where they are subject to the whims of a particular government agency, there is so much money that goes into healthcare on an annual basis. So there is some familiarity within venture capital as a general matter in a regulated space where you need to ultimately get approval for a drug or a device that is out there. And so I think there's probably some learnings there where not everything in the venture world is going to give you a tremendous amount of visibility in, say, the first 9 to 24 months of the life cycle of the company. There are these companies that are backed by venture capital that very much are working towards the goal. And ultimately, they may be turned down by a federal regulator, and that's the end of the company.
Great. Okay.
Raj, just on that point, if I can jump in there,
please.
One thing, not to take issue directly with DIU or these other pockets of innovation that we talked about, but I think we need to make sure that even those areas that are on the forefront of in the government handling these challenges, that they're actually delivering. right? Because yes, we can say, the normal acquisition cycle, it may never catch up to the speed of tech and the speed of VC, but we need to make sure that SBIR, we need to make sure that DIU using OTAs and other tech tools are able to do this work. And just as an example, only 262 of the over 34,000 civil awardees between 2010 and 2020 went on to sell a commercial product to the federal government by a phase 3 contract, right? This is within the kind of tech innovation R&D network, right? And so if we're not able to move fast enough, if AFWorks, again with Open Topic, is revolutionary of even how CIVR is working, but if they're not able to move fast enough to get that kind of best tech that they're developing through their programs into government, and with funding that leads ultimately to those program of records, then we've still got a broken system. And so, I don't want to go back and revise my grade that I gave earlier, but, let's make sure that even those places that are dedicated to this mission of getting that best tech in, let's make sure that they're following through all the way so that we get to that kind of, it's fully bridging the gap. It's fully clearing that valley of death and getting to the program of record. And I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, 286 out of 20,000, Dave, doesn't sound like a high mark for that transition. Okay, we're gonna now go to some Q&A from the audience, and I think the first one we're gonna take is exactly related to what you just described, David. And so this is a question from Johanna, and it's basically, the commercial industry is doing a great job to try to work with DoD, but there's some significant cultural change that's going to be required. So apropos to the stat that you just shared, if all three of you were queen or king of the DoD for a day, maybe a month, however long you want, what's the top thing you would do and enact to actually appreciably, solve this? And let's keep it up. We don't have to get to super DoD Arcania, but what are like real reforms that you think will work, not just the outcome?
Well, we could have a whole panel on this one, couldn't we?
Oh yeah.
So we do. So we've trained over 1,000 people across the DoD in the last couple of years, specifically on how to start aligning culture and behaving differently. And I think one of the biggest gaps that we see is managing by outcome rather than outputs. So for example, we award on time, we let contracts, we spend our money, we're on schedule, we're not on schedule. Those don't actually tell you anything and accomplish anything. And I think there is a retooling of leadership and culture that needs to understand the difference in what it means to actually drive an outcome through a procurement. So let me give you an example. An outcome might be that we were able to reduce the amount of time it takes to do maintenance on a tank. But in the short term, we're measuring, did we get the prototype done or did we get it done on time? Success for that prototype might be, we found out that we couldn't do it through this method and we killed it off. So we don't keep or kill our prototypes very well. But I think that there needs to be, the second thing I would train, we really need to help retool the large sustainment programs and program of records and the PEOs on how to navigate their own bureaucracy to pull this in and teach leaders how to give them top cover on how to do that and really understand the mission. But if I were to also just go a little crazy, I'd say we need to realign the incentive structure for promotion, and it needs to include this, and it needs to show urgency, and it needs to reward the behavior of what's going to move fast, because we're going to lose if we don't do that.
Great. Yeah. And so that's actually mine. So if I were to answer my own question, Megan, it's what you said is changing the incentive structures, right? Where if you make a program go from 3 years to 1 year, you get promoted and here's a big bonus. And if your 3-year program took 5 years, you begin to look for new work. Very hard to do, very hard for senior leaders to do given the civil structure and their own tenures, but it can be done. So I would agree with that. All right, same question for David and Jeff, but I would say really blue sky thinking, man. Think big. You really are king. You've got a 3 million person organization. What are you gonna do?
If my kingdom extends to Congress, or if we can declare war on Congress, I think that would make a difference in how I answer this question. Because I think a big part, some of this comes down to the budget cycle, and all this comes down to how Congress has dictated that this stuff must go. And so I think, we talked briefly with Mike Brown about, the Warfighter Innovation Scaling Fund, right? So how can we actually kind of take some pots of money, get them in the right hands with the right resources to kind of move those pots of money to make these kind of investments, right? So, if we're trying to use them with kind of existing PEOs and existing acquisition officers and in these programs that are moving on a traditional POM cycle, sorry to use DoD speak, it's all going to seem broken, and we're always going to be trying to play catch up. But if we were able to kind of say, we can ignore the kind of color of money problem, because we're able to kind of set aside a very large chunk of money to put these companies in, do a vetting process that makes sense, and then, make some really significant awards that's going to cause, the private sector to take notice. I think we could start to make some big change. And now, again, the structure is there to make sure that there isn't fraud. All of these things, then add bureaucracy back in. But we should start, I think, again, if I'm king, right, we could start by stripping all of that out and saying, okay, here's the pot of money to get us from, these early stage investments to something that can actually end up in the hands of the warfighter. And then, solve the color of money challenges, solve the kind of transparency challenges along the way once we've kind of streamlined that process. And I'd love to see, these incremental steps like the Warfighter Innovation Scaling Fund take on that challenge. But I really do think that, the whole process has to move at the scale of tech. And I'm just not sure that we figured that out in the absence of monarchy.
Got it. Okay. A lot of great finance and money reforms. Jeff?
If I were king for a day, the one thing I would do is I would try and cause a cultural change about how we think about foreign ownership and foreign ownership control and interest specifically. I think that we have not done a good job as a government really distinguishing between who our friends and who our foes are. I think that if you are a venture-backed company and you have some percentage ownership of your company that is owned by a foreign entity, even that is from a friendly country, that can be very problematic to you. It can also be problematic if you've got investment from funds that have limited partners that are from friendly countries. And I think that we talk a lot about adversarial capital. It's been talked about today. I think we need to do a better job of actually delineating what we're really talking about here, because I think that we can all stipulate that the government does not want to do an agreement with a company that is 30% owned by a Chinese entity. But the reality is we live in a complicated and globalized society where some of the most innovative companies do have strategic partnerships and investors that come from other countries. And many of those are friendly to the United States. Many of those are countries that we fight alongside on the battlefield. I think there's a lot of progress that can be made here. And I'm afraid that a lot of the progress in getting innovative technology into the Pentagon is going to be a little bit muted until we recognize that the world is the way it is, and it's unlikely to change anytime soon.
Yeah. So Jeff, it sounds like you believe the pendulum has swung too far to one direction in terms of what's okay and what's not okay from a capital geography standpoint.
I do think that, and I think that you don't have to look any further than the Foreign Investment Risk Remodernization Act that Mike Brown mentioned, where that was notionally all about China and perhaps to a lesser extent about Russia, but the bill did a pretty terrible job from my perspective on delineating on capital coming from friendly countries and non-friendly countries. And there has been a fairly milquetoast attempt by the agencies to try and whitelist certain countries. I don't think that's been terribly effective. There hasn't been a lot of expansion to include a lot of our strategic allies. And so I think that in a lot of haste to try and deal with some concerns around Chinese entities, I think we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater to some extent.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and that again shows with the complexity of the government, you can go in with really great intentions, but the outcomes can be opposite. All right, let's go to another question. It's a different part of the topic. This is from Bill, and he asks, would the Wright brothers have had any better luck selling the airplane to the Pentagon today than they did when they were selling it to the Army Board of Ordnance and Fortification 115 years ago? The Army had no idea back then what World War I would look like 10 years later. What can we do, and we being the collective entrepreneur venture world, can do to help DoD better envision the future? It's not a new problem. They had panels in Zoom 150 years ago. The Wright brothers would have said the same thing.
I would venture to say that we wouldn't have bought them. I mean, I hate to say that. We probably would have flown it, tested it at an airfield somewhere that we did through a CRADA, and it took off. And then we said that was pretty cool. And then we never got it in because one of the big boys is going to build the jet, right? So I do think it's shifted because there was a different time period, and we need to get back to that kind of sense of urgency, I guess, where we need to realize that those types of technologies can be really game changing, and we need to have them to be competitive. Commercial technology has to be competitive to stay alive. That's not any different than the position the DoD is in right now. And we need to have that same sense of urgency. What can tech companies do? I think a lot of it is storytelling. I hate to say it. And actually what Dave said, come to the market and give it a shot because we need you more than anything, and be willing to show the art of the possible. And sometimes there will be education. Do that in a way, though, that's not going to put you out of business because we also need you around. So it's a delicate balance, but I do think it's a very, very important point and a very important issue.
That's great.
Yeah, if I could, fast forward through history a little bit, when we get up through World War I and World War II, and then as we enter in the Cold War, the United States made a huge amount of tech investment, right? We made a huge amount of R&D spending and on things that didn't have obvious payoff on a battlefield, right? The space race, getting to the moon, and these things were kind of national pride issues, in millions, and in today's dollars, billions of dollars are spent on individual parts of that. And I think, we can kind of lament, oh, well, we don't have that level of R&D spending, or we're not doing that sort of thing. But there's a huge amount of technology spending that's happening in the United States right now. By, I think, many measures more than happened in the Cold War, but it's not government spending. And I don't think that we need to try and make it government spending again. But what we need to do, and I think this gets to the question that I think Bill was asking, is, how do we get that in, right? How do we get all this tech and R&D spending into the government? And so I think we do need to spend a lot of time on that, making it easy for these commercial products, these highly developed, heavily researched and developed technologies. How do we get them into the government? And the easy part of that is you don't have to do all that spending from kind of birth of the idea all the way through the product at the end that kind of actually launches for government. But what you do have to do is really, really nail down that, how do we get the best tech in? How do we kind of identify it, and make it easy to purchase? And so more work needs to be done there. So yeah, once there's an airplane sitting on the runway, you could say, hey, the government should have those too, and we can start to buy it.
Makes sense.
Raj, I don't know that I have a great answer to the Wright brothers hypothetical, but I think it's an interesting question. I think that Megan and Dave offered great perspectives.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I think that, my answer to this is, I think the department is trying. There's, their senior leaders are spending a lot of time out here to try to understand what the world would look like, what change is coming. And I think if you just even look at the recent public announcements by the chairman and the secretary, like, they get it, they understand the threat. I think their challenge is more to 2 questions ago about culture and affecting that change in such a large organization. And let's do one more question from the audience, and then we will wrap things up. One thing that no one has brought up in this conversation thus far is the role of the large incumbent defense primes, right? There is a large, significant industry out there. So what are your recommendations in terms of bridging the challenge of integration of unique startup solutions with the large providers of our major weapon systems? What are the opportunities and challenges there?
I could write a whole book on this one. Look, the role of the incumbent in the primes is critical, right? They know the mission, they have the ability to scale at a level that you won't find a lot of times in private sector. That said, they are operating under the incentive structure we have put in place for them. So right now, that model does not include rewards necessarily for bringing in emergent capabilities. You're going to get more money by putting a button seat and building it from scratch, right? And that's one of the dynamics. The government really needs to put different expectations on these primes. And I would say some of them are waking up and understanding that. Some are still doing a little bit of the innovation theater. But one of the mentalities that needs to change is it used to be that the small contractors needed the primes more than the primes needed the subs. And I think that dynamic is going to flip, and the ones that get it will stay on top, and the ones that don't are going to start to fall apart. And changing how you engage with those companies, understanding their business models so that you actually can meet them where they are and are conducive to working with them is going to be super critical. But I think the government has a big role here. We can't, right now, I would say the number of program leaders and senior leaders that will say they're frustrated with their incumbent is very high, but the willingness to do something differently is lower. And there's a mismatch there. So we have to stop being frustrated with the system. We have to change it. And if I was queen for a day, again, I would go back and say, look, when COVID hit, that was a great crisis for us to say, what can we do very quickly, as fast as humanly possible? And we tapped into the innovation base, we leveraged the primes, and we found out quickly where our cracks were, where we could move fast and where we couldn't. And we need to treat the competition with China with that much urgency. And my fear is that we're going to sit on it so long that we will end up in an emergency where we have to do it at that speed. Like, let's just act like that now.
Yeah, it's one thing the Pentagon's good at is acting and responding to crises. David, Jeff, anything else you guys want to add on this one?
Yeah, I think Megan had a great answer, and she talked a little bit about the system designed as it is, and I think we just need to be cognizant that that's not an accident, right? There are millions of lobbying dollars spent. There are, again, a retired general going to these companies to tell them how to do it, and then being part of that network. And again, I'm not identifying this as corruption. I'm not saying that primes are primes because the system is too connected or that they have an unfair influence, but I think it's important to understand that they do have a tremendous amount of influence based on how they can use their dollars and how they can organize the system to work in their favor. And so I think as government officials, as people trying to influence the system, as these small companies are trying to participate in the system, we need to, again, recognize that the primes will be there. None of the companies within the Alliance for Commercial Technology and Government is delivering F-35s or that kind of capability. But if the contracts are all written to be these kind of giant services and products contracts that last 10 years, and the R&D portion is really small, but then it's cost plus, that shuts out a huge amount of the market. And so I think it's really important that we bring the voice of the smaller companies to participate alongside the primes, so that as we think about how we do government contracting, as we think about how we sell licenses, as we think about how we sell products, it's not just the voice of the primes that set the system up to benefit themselves and to make it work for them, as it doesn't work for some of the smaller companies.
That's great, David. So yeah, Jeff, what's your perspective, knowing that there's lots of corollaries to that on the the traditional tech side of venture and large corporates that left on defense? Is there anything specific that makes defense different?
Well, I think the one observation that I would give Raj is that I think that what David and Megan have said is exactly right. I think one interesting thing here is that one observation we have in the marketplace is kind of the growth of corporate venture capital, where you have companies that are perhaps in some situation, these primes we're talking about, that are investing in early stage companies to really gain learnings about how they see the world and what sort of innovative tools they are coming up with. And my sense is that's probably a healthy thing to understand exactly where other companies are coming from. I don't know a lot about the specific role they play in the defense ecosystem, other than to say that corporate venture as a category has been growing and seems to be here to stay. And so, perhaps that is another way in which early stage innovative companies can get capital, but also a lot of the primes can understand who a lot of those new young companies are.
Got it. Great.
I would agree, but I would add in that the corporate venture arms that do exist also need help from the mothership, if you will, integrating what they're finding back into the main business lines, right? In order for those to function is in what we need them to do in this environment.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'd say on this is, you mentioned early on, Raj, that we have the Andurils and the rebellions popping up. They're popping up exactly to solve this problem. They see a gap where they're taking commercial technologies and they're bringing them together in unique ways. And they're specifically going after this incumbent base. It's like they're coming, and we're going to see more and more of those pop up. So understanding those business models, it's changing. And I think we'll continue to see more new players pop in until, the legacy players kind of make a pretty big business shift.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. So here in the last few minutes, we'll try to end on a constructive note. I think we would all on this call, and probably the attendees, agree that bridging this valley of death for innovative companies is a good thing, and it's important. It's important for the defense of democracies and freedom around the world. I think we all fundamentally believe that. What advice would you pick a constituent that you're close to, be it entrepreneurs or other venture capitalists? Like, what's one resource you would offer them to say, Jeff, a firm says, hey, I want to help with this valley and be part of the solution. Who should they call? What resource? What ideas do you have, just to be constructive? It could be call Jeff, but that's what I'd love to end on. What resources would you offer to folks on the call?
Well, this one is an easy one for me, since we're on with two experts, with Dave and Megan. So I think insofar as NVCA members are interested in the defense tech space and they want to learn more about it, we've got two phenomenal resources here. Obviously, DIU and yourself, Raj, are also fantastic. And so I think that would be where I would turn for folks in our membership that want to do more in this category.
It's great, very helpful.
Yeah, you're giving us a great opportunity to advertise for ourselves. So I'll take it and say, look at the Alliance for Commercial Technology and Government. We are engaged with Congress, with the administration on these issues and kind of breaking down these barriers. But that's where I would say, everyone has a member of Congress, and in those offices, in the countless number of conversations I've had since we've launched this organization, Congress is taking these issues seriously. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle it is, they want this growth of the tech sector and working with the government for their constituents. And again, whether it's a top priority or lower on the priority list for any given member, there's definitely a range, but we're not hearing anyone say, oh, this isn't important or we don't care about that. So engage with your members, engage with Congress. Obviously, you can do that through our organization, but there are other ways to do it more directly too. So I would do that. And finally, before I get off the stage here, I do want to thank you, Raj, for leading this panel, and thank all of the people who took the time to join this to engage on this issue. And I think we can make a difference together. For the members of the Alliance, I think this has been a great kickoff for our annual conference. We've got more programming later on. But thank you again for being a part of this. I think it's been really beneficial.
Thanks. Megan, last words.
Right, I'll take the softball too. This is all we do all day, every day, is try to make it easier. We do have a platform that is just a subscription for tech companies that has resources, videos, worksheets, everything you possibly need to know, and a community where you can ask any of our alumni companies questions and also experts. And we have government events. That's easy. You also I will answer anyone's question any day of the week. I feel very passionately to put it back out into the world and do good. I'm happy to connect you with other tech companies that have done it. We've accelerated about 115, 14 of those are unicorns, and they have some battle scars and a lot to share and a lot to learn. So I would say go to the coffee table and have some conversations, and I'm happy to connect you.
That's great. So I'd end it by saying, from my view, I agree with what Phil said at the beginning, it is a Sisyphean task, this defense reform. But I think the good news is what makes it different today than 5 years from now is that there are a whole host of teams and organizations that will help push the rock up the hill together. And many of them are on this call today. So I'm quite optimistic for where it will go and we will overcome these challenges. So again, thanks everyone for their time this morning. Thanks to the participants and the Institute, and have a great day.
And yes, thanks. Huge thanks to everyone all across, participants, attendees, everybody for joining us today. And please do feel free to connect with us at IST, the Alliance, or any of our participants directly for more on these issues. I mean, this is a remote time and it's kind of hard to be on Zoom all the time, but if the best we can do is get sparked, get inspired, and then reach out, I'm sure I speak for everybody here when we are all willing and ready to keep the conversation going. So thanks again for attending. Any questions, please follow up at the Institute for Security Technology or the Alliance for Commercial Technology and Government, and have a great day.
Thanks.